will prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon His beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Sing the wondrous I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is o'er, time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely o'er to Thy kingdom shore, to Thy shore. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, cross is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun, it shall never go down. There are evergreen trees that been blowing in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter than gold. There the throne of God stands in the fairest of lands, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun, it shall never go down.
Genesis chapter 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn Sarah to weep for her. I'm going to stop there for a moment, make some observations here. If Sarah is 127 years old, how old is Abraham? 137. How old is Isaac? 37. He was born when she was 90 and when Abraham was 100. So he was about 37. Now, that becomes important because that gives us a gauge, not an exact, but a gauge about how much time has jumped between chapter 22 and chapter 23. At least a couple of decades. Isaac is but a lad in chapter 22, and now in 23, he's 37 years old. We don't find out anything that happened over those 2 decades. It's actually been even longer than that since we have heard anything about Sarah, particularly. It's been 37 years since we've heard anything about Sarah, particularly, because the last time Sarah is mentioned in this story is when? When she gave birth to Isaac. And so Sarah has gone completely quiet after Isaac is born until she dies. This is a story not so much about Sarah, but about Abraham and about the things that happened following Sarah's death with Abraham. So Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. And so you get to feel for the respect that Abraham had from these people. He is a foreigner who is dwelling in their land. He is respectful of them, I want to start off to say. He doesn't just take for himself what he wants, although he probably could. He's got an army, and he's flexed his muscle, and these people know what he's capable of. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he goes to them acknowledging, hey, I'm a sojourner in this land, and so I want your permission to bury my wife here. And they answer him, Hear us, Lord, you're a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Look, you just pick the place. None of us are going to stand in your way. We understand that you are a prince of God, which simply means what? It's an interesting phrase, a prince of God. We don't use it very often. That's a good guess as any. But prince, I think, really just relates to the fact that he is a man of some authority and power and stature. They're referring to him as he controls a rather large family when you count the servants and all those people. I mean, just a lot of people. He's got an army. So he's a prince in that sense, and I would say in the earthly sense. But not only is he a prince, but he's a prince who has God's blessing. And they recognize that. And so they're like, none of us are going to stand in between you and burying your dead. So you can pick the nicest tomb in the land, and whoever's possession it is, they're not going to stop you from using it. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites. You see this respect that he's showing them. He said to them, If you're willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me and entreat me for Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It's at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for burying place. Okay, so when he says, give me a place to bury, he's not saying, I want you to just hand over this property to me. He's saying, give me permission. And they said, look, you can have anything you want. And he says, okay, if that's the case, this is what I want. So go get the man who owns it. And right here in front of everybody, we're going to engage in a transaction so that I can purchase this property from them. Now, Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites of all who went in at the gate of his city. Okay, and we've talked about that before. What generally happened at this time, cities were walled in. That was their protection. There was a main gate. That was the way you got in and out of the city. The elders, the rulers, the influential people, the powerful people of the city sat at the gates. They discussed affairs and made decisions and heard disputes and all sorts of stuff like that. And in this case, we find out that they also witness business transactions. These are the people who have power. These are the people who have money. These are the people who have stature and influence. And they're kind of the rulers of the city by default. By the time we roll into Israel, we would just refer to these people as what? The elders of the city. All right, so that's what this situation is. And he says, No, my Lord, hear me. This is what Ephron says to Abraham. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that's in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. bury your dead. And Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. Yet again, he is showing deference to them. He is not making demands. He is soliciting their approval. He said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, but if you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead there. So basically Ephron says, look, you want it, you can have it. And Abraham says, no, I want to pay for it. Now, you ever been at lunch table with a friend and got into a dispute about, here, I'll take it, and then you argue over the check? That's what's going on here, only it's for a piece of land. Abraham's saying, I want to pay you for it. This guy's saying, absolutely not. You can have it. Abraham says, no. I want to pay you for it. Ephron then answers Abraham. This is verse 15. My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What's that between you and me? Bury your dead. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can look at this. I don't really know how to read this completely. You can look at this as this is just a normal way of conducting business, where you're just basically saying, no, absolutely not. You can have it. Oh, no, I got to pay for it. Oh, no, you can have it. What's 400 shekels between us? Or if it's really the fact that both these guys have so much wealth that he's really saying, look, it's worth about 400 shekels. That's no big deal. I haven't really lost anything when it comes to you. And by the way, the world still works this way. We think things have changed, but things really haven't changed. You know who gets the most high dollar gifts given to them? The rich people who don't need it. People trip over themselves to give them things. Very few of them today would go, oh, no, I have to pay for it. But Abraham did. He said, nope, I insist on paying for it. And so he says, look, $400, what's that? He says, oh, okay, you've named the price now. Which again, this could be, like I said, first, just a way of being kind and gracious to one another, where I want to buy it. No, you can have it. I want to pay you what it's worth. No, take it. What's something that's only worth this much, just to give that information that he's wanting, which is how much is it worth? Okay, I've given that information, now I know. Okay, you value it at 400 shekels. You know what doesn't happen here? You ever bought a house? Anybody in here ever bought a house? Yeah, I know you have, Mike. And I know you have, Karen, and I know you have David. David's bought several. And no, what happens when you buy a house is somebody says it's worth this much, and what do?
No, it's worth something less.
You say, no, let me counter your offer and give you this much for it. And then they say, oh, no, and then you dicker until you come to an agreeable price. Abraham does not do that. He says, oh, you say it's worth 400 shekels? Take your money. And he just pays him what he asks. So he buys this field so that he has this cave in which he can bury his wife in. Verse 17, so the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was in the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area was made over. Now, that just simply means that there was a contract. It was transferred to Abraham. He now owns it. And he owns all the real property there. And the fact that it talks about the trees there, somewhat important as well, because listen, trees are worth money. And so he's got real estate, and he's got stuff on that real estate, and he now owns that. He has purchased that and bought this little part of Canaan. It no longer belongs to the Hittites. It now belongs to who? Abraham. It was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went into the gate of his city. All right, he did this in front of everyone, right out in the middle of the public, so that no one would ever have any questions about it. Lots of witnesses. After this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Now, a couple of things we want to remember. Already twice, Abraham has gone through this land. Now, he's back living here again, but he had lived there once, had to run away to Egypt for a while. He went back and lived there again. He then moves. He's now back there once again, but twice. As he came into that area and settled, God said to him, what? This is your land. The first time he just generally said, this is your land. The second time, after Lot and he split, God brought him out there and he says, look to the north, look to the south, look to the east, look to the west. Your descendants get all of this land. Abraham already knew that that land, the whole entire area, was going to belong to his descendants one day. Why did he buy that land? God had already given it to him. Okay, there's that starts to show the degree of faith that he had. It kind of reminds me a little bit of David. David had already been promised that he was king. And he had several opportunities to snuff out Saul and take the kingdom. And he said, what? No. No, when God is ready for me to be king, God will work that out and I'll become king. But it's not going to be by my hand. Okay, this kind of reminds me of that. Okay, God's given me this land and I know it's going to be our land. And I think that probably has something to do with why he wants to go ahead and bury Sarah there, because he knows that his descendants are going to be settled there. But he's not going to force the issue. He's going to purchase the land. He's going to purchase the land. No battle takes place here. But through this purchase, they have begun their possession of the land that God had promised them. This is the first little piece of the promised land that, and this is before they were called Israelites because Israel hadn't been born yet, the first little piece of the promised land that the future people of God take possession of and own. He now has control over this territory. It is his, and everybody knows it. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 10 and 11. Speaking of Abraham, says, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. You'll notice that he says, I'm a sojourner in this land. Even though it's been promised to him, even though his descendants are going to dwell there one day and own it all, he still calls himself a sojourner. He's looking for something else. And that is conveyed in this language. The next verse, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she conceived, considered him faithful who had promised. We're introduced right there in Hebrews 11 to not only Abraham being one of great faith, but also what? Sarah. Even though she laughed and she had her struggles and she pushed and I don't know how hard she had to work, but convinced Abraham to take her handmaiden to have a child when she was barren, and all these other things. We have these little bumps in the road, but we have a proclamation from God himself. Hey, Sarah is faithful. And despite the fact that we really don't hear much about her, right? Now, there's one other time she's mentioned in the New Testament. I want to turn your attention there. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. Most of the time she's mentioned in the book of Genesis. She's mentioned in a couple of other places, but only in reference to the fact of, and Sarah, his wife, kind of passages. This one is another one about her. Verse 4, 1 Peter 3, let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that's frightening. We have references in the New Testament to being the children of Abraham spiritually. This is about being the children of Sarah spiritually, and the character. And particularly, I think that if you look at the context, this is borne out and primarily goes toward women and their relationships with their spouse. That's the primary focus. But I do want you to notice the way it ends. If you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. And you go back and reflect on all the stuff that they've been through that we've read about up to this point. And what you see is that this is a proclamation that Sarah had learned to trust God too, and not be afraid of things, and to do the good things that God would have them to do. And that's a general characteristic that has to be present in all of us. We have to do good, and we have to not fear anything. Why should we not fear anything? If God is for us, who can be against us? Should we fear death? No. Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica and told them what? Y'all don't worry about the folks that have died before you. Don't grieve like those who have no hope. Remember the hope that you have. What hope is he talking about? Well, the hope of the resurrection through Christ. So don't grieve, don't fear, don't be terrified about the... Just remember what God promised. Perfect love, the New Testament says, casts out what? All fear. If we love God, then those fears should be dying in us. Now, it's not immediate. That's part of the beautiful part about the story of Abram and Sarah, is we get to watch them grow. We get to watch their faith increase. We get to watch them go from people who at times did fear things to being people who had absolute confidence in God. And that's the same process that we're taking part in, and we ought to be striving toward. Perfecting our faith. And so that's a big part of what we see here in this picture, and why her death becomes important, because this is another snapshot into the absolute confidence that Abraham has of what? God's promise was going to be fulfilled. You know who ended up being buried in that cave? Abraham ended up being buried in that cave right beside Sarah. Who else? Isaac and Rebekah ended up being buried in that cave. I think Jacob and Leah ended up being buried in that cave, if memory serves me correct.
So in the future nation of Israel, that cave, that land is in there?
Yes.
Do you know where?
It's outside of Hebron. Right outside the city of Hebron. Not too far from where Jerusalem eventually would be established.
Identifiable to this day?
I have to check into that before I answer for sure. And the reason I say it that way is because there's a lot of sites over there that are identifiable, that are really just, I think this is it. So I'm not safe of saying whether or not it's...
So much, I don't want to
Yep.
break your class.
No, it's okay.
But these things got buried over time. I don't really kind of understand that. That place has been occupied since that story.
Right. It has. And sometimes, yes, things do get buried. That's why you got to dig them up. And the reason they get buried is because somebody comes along and wants to build on build something new. And what do? They level it, put in some dirt, fill some things in, and build on top of it. And usually archaeology, especially in old parts of the world like that, the further you go down, you get to earlier settlements. So you got this settlement down here, and maybe a sandstorm comes along and covers everything up. And so the next people build on top of it. Various things like that can happen. But I'll check and see if we can find out if we actually know exactly where that cave is. Yes, ma'am.
They mentioned that, as well as telling me that the Jews are saying that the cross they were looking at is made of stone and not wood and other things.
Right.
And then in the Acadiana Mall, there's a poor Egyptian fellow who's from Egypt, and he told me that if I go to Egypt for a tour, I will see the footprint of Adam, which is 12 feet long. And I said,
But I appreciate you bringing that out because it just kind of goes right in line with what I was saying. I'll give you an example just so you understand what I'm saying. Okay, if you go into the promise, into everybody calls it the Holy Land. If you go to Israel, you can go to the Church of the Nativity, and they will show you the spot where Jesus was born. Only problem is nobody knows for sure that's the spot. They just built a church around it and said, hey, this is it. There's several places like that. Several places. There's actually an area in the River Jordan where people travel all the way around the world to get baptized right there in the River Jordan because they think that that's the very spot that Jesus was baptized.
Mom over there.
And I'm not sure we can identify the very spot in the river where Jesus was baptized. I don't even know if the riverbed's in exactly the same place it was in then. And I can promise you this, the water's long gone. It's done been to the sea, evaporated, gone into some clouds. It may have rained in another country. I don't know. It's not the same water. So it gets silly. But it's possible. Because we do know generically where it's at. Because it's right outside of Hebron. And so it's possible maybe that it could be have been found. And
I think a lot of when I think about these things that are phony or commercialized or whatever you want to call them, I think this is probably better than us actually having the real art.
Well,
if we'd be over there really bowing down and going to the church.
well, you're right. And I think that there's reasons. I think there's reasons why we don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is. I think there's reasons why we don't have some of the things that we don't have. Listen, we make some of these things up and people venerate them and worship them and they're, I don't know, completely cut out a whole cloth. I don't know. Some of this stuff is just silly. This is the bone of the finger of this particular person. How do you know it's the bone of his finger? Well, because we found it and I said it was. That's about as much proof as there is. And so it gets carried around the world to different churches and people go and pray in front of it. If we had things that we actually knew, the ark, as in Noah's ark, that would be a big deal. Listen, people already traveled to Kentucky to see one that was built in the last 10 years and rave about it. What would we do if we actually had a piece that we knew for a fact was Noah's ark? I think there's reasons why that stuff can't be found. I think there's reasons why the actual autographs of Paul's letters and Peter's letters and James's letters can't be found. We have lots of reliable copies, enough to confirm that we have the document, but the ones that were written in their hands, we don't have. We have stuff that was written older than that, but we don't have those things. I think God knew what he was doing. If we had those things, people would be worshiping them. And so I think there's reasons. All right, so chapter 24, I got a few minutes left. We won't get into this too deeply, but this is the one that reintroduces Rebekah. Now, what do we know about who Nahor was? Well, yeah, he is, but we'll figure out why that is moving forward. But looking before that, at this particular time frame that we're reading, who is Nahor? He's Abraham's brother. Okay? So that means that he is Isaac's uncle. Rebekah is Nahor's grandfather, I think. So that means that Rebekah is Isaac's cousin. We want to understand these relationships. And as I mentioned in the introduction, this chapter explains why back in chapter 22, we get that little section about who Nahor's sons were and who Rebekah was. Now we find out why that matters. And it is furthering the story of the lineage of Jesus, because Rebekah marries Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, one of whom was Judah. From the tribe of Judah arose the Christ, Jesus. So yes, he is in the lineage of Jesus. He's not in the direct lineage of Jesus, but Rebekah is. So that is why this matters. This isn't records of people getting married. We don't have a record of everybody gets married. We don't have a record of, we said just a moment ago, between chapter 22 and chapter 23, there's over 20 years that we don't have any information about. We don't find out about anybody else, much of Nahor's family and who they marry. We find out about who Rebekah marries. Why? Because Rebekah marries Isaac, and Isaac is the child of promise from Abraham. So we're learning about the fulfillment of the promise. That's what all of this is. I'll remind or help you recall. I think most of us know this. You'll be reminded that in the Gospels, Jesus at one point is walking with some disciples, and it says that he opens their mind and explains to them what Moses and the prophets wrote concerning himself. Guess what Moses wrote? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses wrote things concerning Jesus. And what Jesus did on that road with those disciples was explain to them how this was about him. And we need to be about the business of figuring that out as well, because all of this is recorded so that we can identify who the Christ was. And what this story does as we go through the Old Testament is give us just a little bit more specificity and a little bit more direction. It narrows the family down. It narrows the line down. It specifies the role. It goes from all nations will be blessed to you're going to have this great nation in this land, and through your seed, all nations will be called. And then it just gets more and more specific, and more we start to see that it's not about a physical, earthly relationship thing, that it's actually about a spiritual thing. And the development and growth of faith in the person of Jesus, so that you go, hey, wait a minute. This is the one person in the history of the earth that actually has all of these connections that this is talking about. And it's why, for instance, that Luke, when he traces the lineage of Jesus back, goes all the way back where? To Adam and Eve. So that you can establish the line from the moment he made the promise in Genesis 3:15 to Eve, that through your seed, I'm going to bruise the head of the serpent. The moment he made that promise, it's all about the seed. It's all about how that seed came into the world and accomplished that task and defeated the devil and gave us hope. So that's what this is about. Think about that as you're reading and studying these things. And next week, Lord willing, we will get into the actual marriage. There's some neat stuff that goes on. There's some lessons that we can draw from it that are useful. But please understand that that is really showing us the picture of how God fulfilled his promise. It's not just about the relationships and the people and the history and all that stuff. It's not really about that. Sometimes the Bible calls some of these books of history. Look, it's not books of history. It's records so that we can identify Jesus. Got to stop. Should have stopped.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love.